Hello my friends, welcome to my channel, Lindy's Magpie Reads. If you're new here, I'm Lindy and I read a lot, pretty much a book a day. So I have 7 books to tell you about today and I'm going to just get right into it. Starting with poetry. April is Poetry Month. This is a collection by Sandra Cisneros, who's probably most famous for her work, A House on Mango Street. This new collection is called Woman Without Shame. And these are poems that she wrote in her 50s and 60s. And a lot of the poems have to do with growing older and body image and social issues, social justice, like women disappearing in Mexico. Cisneros was born in the U.S. to Mexican parents, and she now lives in Mexico. I'm going to read an excerpt from Tea Dance, Provincetown, 1982. At the boy bar, no one danced with me. I danced with everyone, the entire room, every song. That's what was so great about the boy bars then. I listen to audiobooks a lot while I am doing other things, including knitting. So there's a short clip here where you can watch me knitting. It's less than a minute, and you can hear Cisneros read from her poem, Canto for a Woman of a Certain Llanto.
Canto for Women of a Certain Llanto, after Dylan Thomas. I'd rather wear none than ugly underwear made for women of a certain age. Rage, rage, do not go into that good night wearing sensible white or beige. Women who have squash blossomed into soft flesh and grieve the frothy loss of the interior garments of youth. Rage, rage, do not go into that good night wearing sensible white or beige.
Next up is another audiobook, Thistlefoot by GennaRose Nethercott, and the audiobook is read by January Lavoy. This is a fantasy set in contemporary Eastern US, and it's the story of a couple of Yaga siblings. Their Jewish ancestors came from Russia when there was a pogrom on the village. And the author did base this story on her own family history. Did I say that it's fantasy? It is, because what happens is these two inherit a house that's shipped over from Russia, and the house is sentient and walks around on chicken legs. So if you're familiar with the Baba Yaga myth, you're going to be right at home with this. So contemporary version, these two are experienced puppeteers, because when they were kids, they used to travel with their parents around the US doing puppet shows. And we have close third-person viewpoint for both of these siblings, Isaac and Bellatine, plus an additional viewpoint from the house in first person. The parts that were narrated by the house are definitely my favorite. I'm going to read you a couple of little excerpts from her parts. Funny how truth changes in the telling, how a person becomes a myth, how a myth becomes a hero. Do not mistake Baba Yaga for the hero of my stories. She is not. She's not the villain either. She is only a woman. And in another part, a house can be burned, a story cannot. What is a house but a container for a life? What is a life but a container for a story? When a container is broken, it does not destroy the contents. It sets them free. I found this delightful. There is an evil entity, the shadow man that is following them and trying to destroy the house. If you are into retellings of myth and all that kind of stuff, I think you're going to enjoy this. It's a long one. I can't remember how long the audiobook was, but it never seemed too long to me. And the third and final audiobook I'm going to tell you about today is called Butts, A Backstory. It's by Heather Radke, who's a white, bisexual American woman with a big butt. And this book is a cultural history, really, focusing on Western attitudes towards our behinds. She starts way back in history to when hominids first started getting around upright, and how discovering a hip bone, they were able to see by the way tendons connect that humans most likely started moving around upright in order to run. And so we are built to run. There's another thing that animals like humans who are built for running have tendons to keep our neck steady, to prevent them from flopping around when we run, whereas other animals that aren't built for running don't have that. And apparently we've had this right from the start. So yes, we were built to run. Not that I'm very fond of running, but that's beside the point. She talks about Sara Baartman, who was a member of the Khoi people from the southern part of Africa. And in the early 1800s, she was brought to London and treated as a sideshow, where people would look at her large backside and even, pay extra to poke it and pinch it. And Radke says that the attitude in the West towards butts has pretty much been shaped by that, in that large butts have become associated with the exotic and the erotic. And there's most definitely a racial element as well. The section about clothing and how clothes fit our bodies I found extremely interesting, because Radke herself is a person who could never find clothes to fit properly. And she says, you always feel like your body is the problem. It's not the clothes, it's your body. And doing research for this book, she discovered the opposite is true. There's nothing wrong with our bodies. It's the clothing industry and trying to have uniform sizes, because it's just not possible. A woman who went around in, I think it was the 1940s, measuring thousands of American women. She threw out all of the measurements that weren't of white women, by the way, and she came up with standard sizes, 27 different standard sizes. But clothing manufacturers said that would be way too expensive, and so they went with just, kind of basic bust measurement, and it's just no wonder clothing does not fit us properly. Very few people are the standard size. That measuring project, by the way, had to do with eugenics, and I learned that there was even better baby competitions going on across the Midwest at farm fairs. So it was kind of like a 4-H competition, but instead of a pig, it was your baby that was being judged for the most eugenic baby. Yeah. She also talked about the notion of normal and how it's not about averages or commonly occurring traits. Instead, it's about an unattainable ideal, which is another notion that really has stuck with me from this book. There's a whole lot in there about celebrities, people I never heard of, people I have heard of, but I had to go to YouTube, like Jennifer Lopez and her butt. I had no idea. I had to go and see for myself. The Kardashians. I remember in the early 2000s when I worked at the main library at lunchtime one day, because I had seen the Kardashians on the cover of a bunch of magazines there at the library, and I said, what are they famous for? Like, is it music? Is it film? Are they in movies? Is it royalty? I don't understand about all these Kardashians. And my colleagues told me, they're just famous for being famous. And yeah, a whole new concept for me. But anyway, yeah, in this book I learned about the Brazilian butt lift, and something that I was very familiar with in the 80s, and that was all of the aerobics craze, Jane Fonda videos, Buns of Steel. She goes into that. She also talks about twerking and says that most white people hadn't heard of twerking until Miley Cyrus did that awkward thing on TV, and I actually do remember that, and I hadn't heard of twerking till then. But this book had me going to YouTube to look up people that Radke was talking about, like the Yin Yang Twins doing Whistle While You Twerk. And when I watched the women in that video twerking, I thought that looks so much like the Trinidadian women that I had staying at my place in the 90s, who, the dance, they called it the wine. I don't know what the difference is, so if any of you do know the difference between twerking and Trinidadian whining, please let me know in the comments. Radke also mentions the trans woman Katey Red from New Orleans and Big Freedia. And I had to watch a bunch of their videos as well. A very joyful butt action going on there. Anyway, this audiobook it's not very long, it's not academic at all, although I can tell that a lot of research went into it, but it's more like fun pop cultural history. So I do recommend it. I loved it. Next up is another very fun book, horror fiction. Could call it Gender Apocalypse. It's called Manhunt by Gretchen Felker-Martin. I already had it on my radar, but most recently Kevvie talked about it as a part of a stellar lineup of booktubers on the announcement video for Miserable May on Scott's Gunpowder Fiction and Plot channel. So I will link that below. And this is one of my reads for Trans Girl April. Felker-Martin is trans, and this story is definitely from a trans viewpoint. What's happened in this story, it's I think set in something like 2018. It's alternate history because it's science fiction. And a virus has affected everyone that has a lot of testosterone. Men turn into these cannibals, basically, and their body changes and in really ugly ways. I did have some trepidation about picking it up because I knew that it was going to be very violent, but I was immediately engrossed, and yes, the violence is kind of over the top, but I immediately connected with the characters. There's a couple of trans women that we meet right from the start, Beth and Fran, and they're hunting men for their gonads. And I also could really feel the emotional truth of this novel, the sadness of transphobia, of self-hatred, what's going on with TERFs. If you're not familiar with that term, it stands for Trans Exclusionary Radical Feminists. Look at this epigraph for part 3, TERF War. When I first learned the term brick for those square, never will be passable trans women, it was auxiliary to an explanation for another term, masonry, as in brick on brick love. Only bricks get stuck to other bricks. Except what do you do with the meanness of the word masonry itself? It was other trans women, the only ones that bricks could supposedly trust, who came up with that hilariously cruel slang, brick on brick betrayal. But we have to understand each other well to be so cruel. That quote's by Tori Peters, who wrote Detransition Baby. That's the kind of sadness I'm talking about, the knife to the heart sadness. In some ways, this book reminded me of The Trees by Percival Everett, but Everett's book is more satirical, I would say, than this one, really pushing things to the max. Whereas the heart in Manhunt stays really close to the surface. Now, I'm a person who does not like to read about sex, so I'm going to warn you, there is a lot of sex in this book. And so I had to do a lot of skimming when I got to those parts. I don't think I would have liked this in audio. It's harder to do that when you're listening to an audiobook. But the sex parts actually did remind me of the way Brandon Taylor writes about sex in Filthy Animals and in Real Life, where the sex and violence are kind of intertwined. There's a lot of that. There's some tender sex as well, but still, I don't like any sex in my books. When I was partway through reading it and was talking to Sean the Book Maniac, he thought that was quite hilarious. I was okay with the violence, but too much sex for me. It's the way it is. Anyway, this book is fantastic. So if you think that you can stomach some gore, please do give this a go. Next up is another book by a trans author, Robyn Gigl. It's called Survivor's Guilt. This is book 2 in the Erin McCabe series. I read the first one last year called By Way of Sorrow, and book 3 is coming out in May. That one is called Remain Silent. So these are legal thrillers. Erin McCabe is a lawyer. In both the first book and in this one, the person that she's representing is a trans woman. Mysteries and courtroom dramas aren't so much my thing. I know I enjoy them now and then, like I did enjoy this one, but the main elements that I enjoyed are the characters. So Erin McCabe and her law partner, Dwayne Swisher, I really like them, and Erin's relationship with her mother, with her father, her brother. Erin started seeing this guy, Mark, in the previous book, and Mark is back in the picture in this book, and how things go with that relationship. Those are all the things that really kept me reading in this. I think Erin's inability to love herself really touched me, and she's come a long way in this second book in that regard. And yeah, very enjoyable, quick read. You don't need to read these two in order, but because of the character development, I think it'd be much more enjoyable if you start with By Way of Sorrow before picking up the second one. Next up, I have an art book, Wild Textiles by Alice Fox. Last up, this is the best thing that I have finished in the past week, and it's actually a long online essay, the Nobel lecture called The Tender Narrator by Olga Tokarczuk, Nobel Prize winner for literature, and it's translated into English by Jennifer Croft and Antonia Lloyd-Jones. I suggested this for my feminist book club, and we had a great time discussing it. We didn't even get to all of the many interesting points that she raises in this about literature and reading in our lives and the kind of books that Tokarczuk wants to write and why she writes the way she does. She talks about genre, so many things. It's not a long read, and I will include a link so you can check it out yourself and leave comments. If I would have been reading it on paper, I would have been flagging every paragraph. It's just so quotable, fantastic. Loved it. Loved it. Yeah. And that's all I've got for you today. I'm going to include a tiny little clip at the end of our dog Joni and her mother Nikika playing in our backyard. We had Nikika with us for over Easter weekend, so you can see the state of our garden. Very brown still. Not much snow left there though, fortunately. And I want to thank you all for watching. I look forward to your comments as always, so please say hello down there and whatever else you want to tell me. I look forward to seeing you again soon. Bye for now.